Sony A7IV and Sony A7R III are really close in terms of price range, but do they have the same performance in terms of videography aspects? In this video, I'm going to review all the important videography features of these two cameras to see which one performs better to help you decide which one to get. The most important difference which separates these two cameras apart is the bit depths. The Sony A7IV supports a 10-bit codec, but the Sony A7R III only supports that old 8-bit codec which most of Sony cameras have. In terms of video bitrate and codecs, the Sony A7IV supports newer codecs like XAVC-I 4K, which is all intra, and supports up to 600 megabits per second, which is really awesome. But the Sony A7R III, like most of old Sony cameras, only supports those 8-bit codecs with a maximum rate of 100 megabits per second. Both of these cameras have a 5-axis in-body stabilization, but the Sony A7IV has a new software feature, which is the active stabilization, which does a slight 1.1 crop on the footage and gives you a smoother result compared to the old standard stabilization which is available on the Sony A7R III. And another amazing feature which you get with the Sony A7IV is the gyro data, which helps you smooth the footage with the software Sony Catalyst Browse or Sony Catalyst Prepare, which will give you an amazing result which is somehow similar to a gimbal, which you can use and take advantage of it. The Sony A7IV has a fully articulating screen, which is really important feature for videographers and comes really handy, but the Sony A7R III has that old flip-up screen, which might be somehow handy, but you cannot articulate it fully in order to take advantage of the vlog features and much more. And the Sony A7IV comes with so many great new features, which is the focus mapping, the lens breathing compensation, and the variable shutter, which you do not see on the Sony A7R III. And you also get a new menu interface. And there's also lots of small details and features which you get on the Sony A7IV, but you do not see on the Sony A7R III. With that said, let's go and test these two cameras to see which one performs better in terms of the videography features, and I'm going to use the Sony Fe 85mm lens for all the tests. Now let's go and see how they perform. So let's start with 1080p 25 frames per second, no picture profile. We are seeing Sony A7R III footage and then Sony A7IV. As you see, there's a little bit of difference in tonality. We see a magenta cast in Sony A7R III footage, but the Sony A7IV is more neutral. And here we are testing the 4K, and I set the zebras to 100 for the footages, but we are seeing a little bit of overexposure patch on the skin with the Sony A7R III. And then I switched to S-Log3 profile, which I really like because it gives me so much flexibility with the color correction. And I just did a simple color space transform with the DaVinci Resolve, and I didn't change the temperature. And as you see again, the Sony A7IV footage is more neutral, but we are seeing a little bit of magenta-ish and warmer tone with the Sony A7R III footage, even on S-Log3 profile. And here you see the Sony A7IV with the 4K and S-Log3, which is really neutral. I really like the pleasing look which you get with the Sony A7IV, a newer codec and a newer color science. And here I tested the all intra 600 megabits to see if there is any difference with the 100 megabits XAVC, and we do not see much difference with the normal color grading. Now it's time to do extreme dynamic range test with the subject placing in front of the sunset, and as you see we have a little bit of autofocus problem with the Sony A7R III in S-Log3 profile. Here I did a simple color space transform with the DaVinci, and as you see the subject is a little bit contrasty and you do not see great details in the face. And if we zoom on it, you see patches of noise on the skin, and the skin tone doesn't look really great with the Sony A7R III in an extreme dynamic range scenario. Here we see the Sony A7IV again with the S-Log3 profile. I have set the zebras to 94 for the S-Log3, and I am exposing for the 94 for the sun. And as you see here, we did a simple color space transform, and you see that the skin looks really natural and beautiful. We have lots of details in the skin, in the shadows, and as you see, it is really clean, and the skin tone looks really clean, and it is more 3D. We have more depths in the shadows, in the noise floor, which is really nice. And when we compare it, you see that how much difference we have here with the 10-bit footage with the Sony A7IV. This is where the Sony A7IV shines, and if I zoom on the pictures, you see that we have much more detail, and the picture is more 3D and cinematic, even though I didn't do a color grading here, just a simple color correction. And here is a XAVC-I footage to see if there is any difference between the footages of Sony A7IV in XAVC-S and XAVC-SI, and I do not see much difference. If we do some heavy color gradings, we might see differences. Now it's time to do an autofocus speed and responsiveness test. We start with the Sony A7R III. I run through the camera, and as you see here, they both perform really good. And we see a little bit of crop with the 4K with the Sony A7R III. That's why the pictures are a little bit different with each other. And here I walk to the camera, and as you see, it is keeping me in focus really well, the Sony A7R III. And then I do a zigzag movement, and it might lag a little bit behind me, but not so much. And here again with the Sony A7IV, I walk to the camera, and these footages were shot in S-Log3, and as you know, it is harder for camera to focus in S-Log3 picture profile, and this was around the sunset. And as you see here, when I leave the frame, it takes a lot of time for the Sony A7R III, and it struggles to focus. And if we compare it with the Sony A7IV, you see that the Sony A7IV with its newer focusing system works really much better, and it is more responsive to my movements. When I leave the frame, it focuses really fast, and if we do a comparison, you see that the Sony A7IV clearly wins in this area and works much better. And here we see another test with the Sony A7R III. I put my hands in front of my eyes. It's a little bit slow, not as snappy as Sony A7IV, but it works. But if we check the Sony A7IV, you see that it is really fast and snappy and works really flawlessly. And here you see a comparison of these two. So this was it for the review of the Sony A7IV versus the Sony A7R III in terms of the videography features. What do you think, guys? Which one performed better? Do you see any difference, and is it worth it to get the Sony A7IV over the Sony A7R III? I would be glad to hear your opinions, and I will be seeing you in my future videos. Goodbye.